How many chances would you give someone who unknowingly destroyed something precious in your life, if that same person was the only one capable of helping you rebuild yourself? Hi, I'm Yuna, and I welcome you to Happiness of Love. Get ready for an exciting story that will leave you amazed. Enjoy the video, and may God bless you and your entire family. Have an amazing day. Dominic pressed the accelerator pedal hard, and the deafening roar of the sports car's engine reverberated around the private test track. The speedometer rose like a missile, reflecting in his eyes, as cold as they were calculating. He leaned forward, a faint smile of defiance curving his lips as the surrounding trees turned into blurs. The wind was whistling, but Dominic felt nothing but adrenaline coursing through his veins. For him, speed was power, and in that instant, he was untouchable. The race ended in seconds, the car stopping with millimeter precision at the exact point marked on the ground. Dominic got out, taking off his helmet and running a hand through his perfectly straightened hair. His assistants rushed toward him, carrying clipboards and tablets. Is it approved? He asked, his voice firm and authoritative, almost perfect. Mr. Dominic, but the engineer hesitated, fearing the critical look Dominic gave him. It's barely enough. He cut the man off, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive shirt. If we're going to launch the fastest car on the market, it needs to be impeccable. I want you to redo the calculations and bring me results by tomorrow. Is that understood? The engineers shook their heads hastily, and Dominic walked away, with the confident posture of someone who had the world at his feet. For him, perfection was not just a goal, it was the only option. Across town, Ava wiped the soot off her hands with an old rag, sitting on the concrete floor of the modest warehouse where she worked. On a makeshift table, parts from a disassembled engine were spread out, each one carefully analyzed. She turned a screw, muttering to herself as she consulted a scribbled notebook. If I recalibrate the torque here, I might be able to solve the overheating problem. A sigh escaped her as she leaned her head against the wall. Hours of work, and yet it felt like there was a long way to go. Her phone vibrated on the table, and she quickly answered it when she saw her sister's name. Hey Sophie, how are you? She said, trying to hide the tiredness in her voice. Are you still there? Ava, it's after 10 at night. I know, but it's important. She looked at the engine with determination. If I can finish this project, I can finally get on the big company's radar. I can't give up now. On the other end of the line, Sophie sighed, but she knew her sister's stubbornness well. Just, don't forget to take care of yourself, okay? Ava smiled slightly. I promise I'll take care of myself. Good night, Sophie. After hanging up, she went back to work, adjusting one more piece and watching as everything began to take shape. For Ava, every little progress was a step towards the recognition she sought. She was tired of being underestimated, and no matter how hard it got, she would show the world, and herself, that she was capable of reaching the top. Meanwhile, in Dominic's plush office, he perused performance reports. But his mind wandered to something bigger, his company's next big project. He wanted to create something that no one could surpass, that would show the world why he was the best. He was a man who did not accept failures, neither in machines nor in people, and it was at this relentless pace that the two continued their lives. Dominic, trapped in his never-ending search for perfection, and Ava, determined to prove that she had something unique to offer. They didn't know it yet, but their paths were about to collide in a way that would change everything. The competition hall was packed with renowned engineers, investors and CEOs, all gathered under one roof in search of the next big automotive innovation. Bright lights reflected off the models on display, each carefully assembled to impress. Ava stood next to her prototype, adjusting the last details, her heart beating as if it wanted to escape her chest. She had spent months dedicating all her nights and weekends to building that engine, a revolutionary idea that could change the future of the automotive industry, but the voice in his head whispered a familiar insecurity. What if they don't like it? What if they laugh? Ava shook off the thoughts. She had worked too hard to let herself be consumed by doubt. Now, across the room, Dominic observed everything with the same calculating intensity he used to evaluate every aspect of his life. Wearing a perfectly tailored suit, he was the embodiment of authority and self-confidence. While the other judges murmured among themselves about the projects presented, Dominic remained silent, his eyes fixed on the next exhibitor. He knew that most of them were nothing more than wannabes trying to impress, and he had little patience for amateurs. Finally, it was Ava's turn. She took a step forward, feeling the weight of the stairs. Its prototype, a uniquely designed hybrid engine, shone under the stage lights. Ava took a deep breath and began. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Phoenix system. It combines traditional fuel efficiency with an innovative integration of renewable energy. With this engine, we are not just reducing emissions. We are redefining performance without compromising sustainability. Dominic tilted his head slightly, his eyes scanning the engine as if he could figure it out just by looking. He silently admitted that the design was interesting. But then, Ava made the mistake he always thought was unforgivable, falling in love. Her voice took on an enthusiastic tone as she talked about how the project was born out of her determination to create something that truly mattered. When she finished, a faint wave of murmurs filled the room. Some seemed impressed. Others, curious. And then Dominic raised his hand. The hall fell silent. Interesting, he began, his voice soft but with a cold tone that made Ava brace herself for the blow. But interesting is not enough. The idea of energy efficiency is something the industry has been exploring for years. Your proposal is ambitious, but the execution seems too idealistic. Do you really believe this engine could compete in the real market, with the demands we face today? Ava felt the blood rush to her face. Dominic's words sounded like a direct insult to the work she had dedicated her soul to. But she wasn't the type to back down. With all due respect, Mr. Dominic, she said, keeping her voice steady even though she could feel the heat of anger rising. The idea of energy efficiency is not just an exploitation. It is a necessity. The Phoenix system is not just another attempt at innovation, it is the future that your company seems to be ignoring. And as for execution, perhaps you are underestimating what a determined engineer can achieve. The silence in the hall was almost palpable. Dominic raised an eyebrow, surprised by Ava's direct and fearless response. Few people dared to confront him like that, especially in public. He should have been irritated, but instead he felt something he hadn't expected: curiosity. Tension hung in the air like a taut thread, ready to snap. Some in the audience exchanged glances, others whispered among themselves, impressed by Ava's courage. Dominic, however, maintained his composure. Interesting, he repeated, a slight smile curving his lips, but without softening the tone of challenge in his voice. Very interesting. Let's see how far her determination can take her. Ava took a deep breath as he walked away, ending the exchange with calculated indifference. On the outside, she maintained her poise, but on the inside, her emotions were in turmoil. Part of her wanted to scream, part of her wanted to run. But most decided that this was just the beginning. If Dominic thought he could intimidate her, he was sadly mistaken. Dominic, meanwhile, walked away, but couldn't shake Ava from his thoughts. Something about her conviction moved him, even if he didn't want to admit it. Ava adjusted her Ava Thompson name badge and shiny Stark Automotive logo as she walked through the company building's plush lobby. It was her first morning as an engineer on the research and development team, and despite feeling the adrenaline rushing through her veins, she remained firm and confident. He wouldn't let anyone know that his hands were sweating or that his heart was beating at a frantic pace behind his thin-framed glasses. His eyes swept the room. The marble gleamed as if it were new, and the chandeliers hanging from the ceiling reflected a luxury so opulent it was intimidating. But Ava wasn't impressed by facades. For her, what mattered was work. Upon entering the meeting room where the team was waiting for her, she was greeted by curious looks. Some were openly skeptical, others merely polite. Dominic sat at the head of the table, his impeccable suit highlighting his authority. When she entered, he didn't even look directly at her. He was busy shuffling through papers as if her arrival was something insignificant. Welcome, Thompson, Dominic said, finally looking up. His voice was cold, almost monotonous, but his gaze carried something more. A silent judgment, an implicit challenge. I hope you're ready to work under pressure. There's no room for hesitation here. I never hesitate, Ava replied calmly, her voice sounding assured even though she could feel the weight of all the eyes in the room. Dominic tilted his head slightly, an enigmatic expression dancing in his eyes. Good. Because our team is already behind schedule on the hybrid performance project, and we're going to need innovative solutions, the kind of solutions you seem to think you can deliver. Ava felt the sarcasm in his last sentence, but didn't take the bait. Instead, he just nodded. I understand the importance of the schedule, Mr. Dominic. And I believe I can help achieve it. The meeting continued with a succession of graphs, tables and technical debates, but the air was charged with tension. Dominic made a point of punctuating each of Ava's suggestions with incisive questions, as if he were trying to expose some flaw in her reasoning. After the meeting, as the team dispersed, Ava remained in the room, adjusting the papers she had brought. Dominic stood next to the table, his eyes fixed on her. You know you're going to need more than good ideas to survive here, don't you? He said, his tone challenging. I know, Ava replied, without looking at him. But I also know that good ideas are more than enough to upset people who are afraid of change. The response was quick, almost sharp. Dominic felt an unexpected heat rise to his skin, a mixture of irritation and admiration. I wasn't used to being challenged, much less by someone so new to the team. We'll see how long you can maintain that posture, he replied, with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. In the days that followed, Ava dove headfirst into work. Every little progress was a personal victory, but the atmosphere in the company didn't make it easier. Dominic was always close by, observing, pointing out flaws, questioning every detail of his decisions. He seemed determined to make her prove that she deserved that place, or perhaps to make her give up. There was a moment when he walked past her workstation, watching her test a prototype on the simulator. Ava was focused, adjusting the parameters and monitoring the results. He stopped behind her, not saying anything, just watching. Do you need anything, Mr. Dominic? She asked, without looking away from the screen. I'm just trying to understand how you intend to fix the heat dissipation problem in the engine without compromising efficiency, he replied, his voice thick with skepticism. Ava slowly turned to face him, determination shining in her eyes. I already corrected it. That's what you're seeing now. Dominic looked at the screen, surprised to see how promising the numbers looked. He opened his mouth to respond, but the confidence on Ava's face made him hesitate. Later that night, alone in his office, Dominic leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the window. He was angry, not just at Ava, but at himself. There was something about her that challenged him in a way he couldn't ignore. Ava, for her part, left the office late that night, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. I knew I had won a small battle, but there was still a long way to go. She knew Dominic was testing her, but what he didn't know was that she had no intention of giving in. The sun was setting behind the horizon, tinting the windows of Stark Automotive with orange hues. Ava sat at her desk, hunched over a notepad, scribbling down calculations and technical schematics that seemed to live only in her mind. She had taken the lead on an ambitious project to redesign the cooling system for the new hybrid engine, and although the hours were long, she felt alive. The opportunity to prove herself was enough fuel to keep her awake despite her physical exhaustion. The door to the technical laboratory opened with a firm click. She knew who it was before she even looked up. Dominic had that kind of presence that filled the space without even saying a word. He walked over to her, hands in the pockets of his impeccably tailored suit, shoes echoing softly on the floor. You never go home, do you? He commented, tilting his head slightly as he watched her. And you? Ava responded without taking her eyes off the drawing in front of her, drawing a line with precision. Dominic suppressed a smile. He was used to employees being intimidated by his presence, but Ava seemed immune to any kind of pressure. It was both irritating and fascinating. How is progress in the system? He asked, now serious, approaching the table. Well, Ava replied, handing him a report with the latest data. Preliminary tests indicate a significant reduction in overheating without compromising efficiency. It's just the beginning, but the results are in line with what we expected. Dominic analyzed the graphs, his eyebrows furrowing slightly. He found no glaring flaws, which only increased his curiosity about Ava. She was meticulous, determined, and her every movement seemed charged with purpose. Interesting, he said, handing back the report. But this still needs to be validated in real conditions. I know, Ava replied, her voice calm but firm. And I'm already organizing a test on the prototype. It will be next week. Dominic nodded, realizing there was nothing else to criticize. Still, he didn't move away. Instead, he stood there for a few more seconds, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. You like what you do, don't you? He asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Ava finally looked up, surprised by the question. Of course. And you? Dominic hesitated. He knew the obvious answer would be to say yes, but there was a part of him that was missing something. Something that was not part of the corporate world, the endless meetings or the numbers that defined their success. Sometimes, he replied, voice lower, almost like a confession. Ava frowned, intrigued. But before he could ask what he meant, Dominic looked away and changed the subject. That night, Dominic left earlier than usual. Your driver dropped you off in a discreet part of the city, far from the skyscrapers and the glitz of Stark Automotive. He walked to a hidden warehouse, where the sound of engines echoed through the metal structure. A rare smile crossed his face as he saw the cars lined up, each one a work of mechanical art. It was there, in the clandestine street races, that he felt alive. The adrenaline of being in control, the freedom to drive without restrictions. It was something he never shared with anyone. Meanwhile, Ava, back in the laboratory, found herself in a moment of reflection. Looking at the dismantled engine in front of him, his mind wandered to the past. Memories of his father, also an automotive engineer, came flooding back. He had been her biggest supporter, until the day a brutal accident during an exhibition race took her life. Ava took a deep breath, trying to push away the pain. Working with cars was both his passion and his biggest source of internal conflict. Each project she completed was a way to honor her father's memory, but also a constant reminder of the price he had paid. A few days later, Dominic and Ava crossed paths again, this time at Stark Automotive's outdoor test yard. Ava was adjusting the prototype before testing when she noticed Dominic watching from afar. "Are you just going to watch or are you going to get your hands dirty?" she teased, raising an eyebrow. Dominic smiled, approaching. "I prefer to watch. Sometimes. The best way to learn about someone is by observing." Ava let out a short laugh, but realized there was an unexpected sincerity in her words. As testing began, Dominic was impressed with Ava's ability to lead the team, drive adjustments, and interpret data in real time. She had a way of commanding that commanded respect, a trait he recognized as a reflection of himself. When the tests were over, and the results were a success, Ava could barely hide her satisfaction. She looked at Dominic, expecting some critical comment, but to her surprise, he just nodded, a rare sign of approval. "Good job," he said. And although the words were simple, Ava realized they meant more than they seemed. The laboratory lights glowed dimly that night, reflecting off the metal panels and parts scattered across the benches. Ava was alone, absorbed in her work. A bold idea had been taking shape in his mind for weeks, something that could take the concept of hybrid engines to a completely new level. She knew it was risky, not just technically, but also politically, within Stark Automotive. Dominic had already made it clear that he preferred to proceed safely, and that didn't include betting on something as radical as what she was proposing, but Ava couldn't ignore the vision she saw. The passion in his chest pulsed stronger than the fear of breaking the rules. With steady hands, she adjusted the sensors on the small prototype she had built, muttering to herself as data began to appear on the screen. "Come on, just show me. I'm right." When the numbers finally stabilized, a victorious smile lit up his face. That was it. It worked. The sound of the door opening behind her broke the silence, and Ava turned quickly, her heart racing. Dominic entered, his expression hard as granite. "What is that?" He pointed to the prototype on the bench, his voice low but full of tension. Ava hesitated for a moment, before taking a deep breath and responding, "It's an experimental project. Something I've been working on in my spare time. I in your spare time?" Dominic repeated, the incredulity in his voice quickly being replaced by something sharper. "You are working in secret on something that directly affects our strategy and you didn't feel it necessary to inform me." Ava felt his anger like a blow to the stomach, but she stood her ground. "I didn't think you'd be interested, considering how risk-averse you are. And I wanted to prove that it was viable before bringing it up for discussion." Dominic took a step closer, his eyes fixed on her as if trying to decipher something beyond her words. "This is not about proving something. This is about trust. And you just showed me that you don't trust me enough to share your ideas, and have you ever given me any reason to trust that my ideas would be taken seriously?" Ava countered, her voice rising a notch. "Since the day I came here, you have done everything to test me, tease me, and treat me as if I were inferior. So yes, I decided the best way to prove myself was by showing results rather than asking for permission." Looking at the dismantled engine in front of him, his mind wandered to the past. Memories of his father, also an automotive engineer, came flooding back. He had been her biggest supporter, until the day a brutal accident during an exhibition race took her life. Ava took a deep breath, trying to push away the pain. Working with cars was both his passion and his biggest source of internal conflict. Each project she completed was a way to honor her father's memory, but also a constant reminder of the price he had paid. A few days later, Dominic and Ava crossed paths again, this time at Stark Automotive's outdoor test yard. Ava was adjusting the prototype before testing when she noticed Dominic watching from afar. "Are you just going to watch or are you going to get your hands dirty?" she teased, raising an eyebrow. Dominic smiled, approaching. "I prefer to watch. Sometimes. The best way to learn about someone is by observing." Ava let out a short laugh, but realized there was an unexpected sincerity in her words. As testing began, Dominic was impressed with Ava's ability to lead the team, drive adjustments, and interpret data in real time. She had a way of commanding that commanded respect, a trait he recognized as a reflection of himself. When the tests were over, and the results were a success, Ava could barely hide her satisfaction. She looked at Dominic, expecting some critical comment, but to her surprise, he just nodded, a rare sign of approval. "Good job," he said. And although the words were simple, Ava realized they meant more than they seemed. The laboratory lights glowed dimly that night, reflecting off the metal panels and parts scattered across the benches. Ava was alone, absorbed in her work. A bold idea had been taking shape in his mind for weeks, something that could take the concept of hybrid engines to a completely new level. She knew it was risky, not just technically, but also politically, within Stark Automotive. Dominic had already made it clear that he preferred to proceed safely, and that didn't include betting on something as radical as what she was proposing, but Ava couldn't ignore the vision she saw. The passion in his chest pulsed stronger than the fear of breaking the rules. With steady hands, she adjusted the sensors on the small prototype she had built, muttering to herself as data began to appear on the screen. Come on, just show me. I'm right. When the numbers finally stabilized, a victorious smile lit up his face. That was it. It worked. The sound of the door opening behind her broke the silence, and Ava turned quickly, her heart racing. Dominic entered, his expression hard as granite. What is that? He pointed to the prototype on the bench, his voice low but full of tension. Ava hesitated for a moment, before taking a deep breath and responding, "It's an experimental project. Something I've been working on in my spare time. I in your spare time?" Dominic repeated, the incredulity in his voice quickly being replaced by something sharper. "You are working in secret on something that directly affects our strategy and you didn't feel it necessary to inform me." Ava felt his anger like a blow to the stomach, but she stood her ground. "I didn't think you'd be interested, considering how risk-averse you are. And I wanted to prove that it was viable before bringing it up for discussion." Dominic took a step closer, his eyes fixed on her as if trying to decipher something beyond her words. "This is not about proving something. This is about trust. And you just showed me that you don't trust me enough to share your ideas, and have you ever given me any reason to trust that my ideas would be taken seriously?" Ava countered, her voice rising a notch. "Since the day I came here, you have done everything to test me, tease me, and treat me as if I were inferior. So yes, I decided the best way to prove myself was by showing results rather than asking for permission." Her words hit Dominic like an unexpected punch. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For a brief moment, his hardened expression faltered, revealing something more vulnerable, something he didn't want anyone to see. "You don't understand, Ava," he began, his voice now lower, almost hoarse. "My responsibility here is to ensure that this company remains the best. Every decision I make carries the weight of hundreds of people who depend on it. I can't afford to let something get out of hand, and I understand that," Ava replied, frustration boiling over. "But don't you realize that sometimes you have to take risks to achieve something truly innovative? You talk as if you're the only one carrying responsibilities, but we're all trying to build something here. And I won't apologize for believing in what I do." Dominic stared at Ava for long seconds, as if trying to find the right words. But in the end, he just shook his head, his expression hardening again. "It seems like we're on opposite paths," he said finally, turning to leave. Ava stood there, looking at the door he had just walked through. Her heart felt heavy like lead, frustration and sadness mixing in a tight lump in her throat. The next morning, the atmosphere in the office was tense. Dominic avoided any direct contact with Ava, while she, in turn, focused on her regular work, but his presence was impossible to ignore. The team noticed the change in mood, but no one dared comment. Dominic was in his office, looking at the charts and reports that Ava had left behind the night before. He couldn't deny that the numbers were impressive. Her idea was bold but brilliant. Still, he felt something like betrayal creeping under his skin. Why was it so difficult for him to trust someone like Ava? That night, Dominic went to his private track, the same one where he used to test cars to vent his frustrations. He accelerated the car to the limit, the roar of the engine echoing in his ears, but even adrenaline couldn't drown out the turmoil in his mind. He thought about Ava, about the passion with which she defended her ideas, about the way she faced him without fear. He knew there was something more behind his reaction. It wasn't just about authority or control. It was about how she made him feel challenged, intrigued and, in a way he didn't want to admit, vulnerable. Meanwhile, Ava was in her small apartment, looking out the window at the bright city. She felt exhausted, but not from the work, from the tension between her and Dominic. Part of her wanted to hate him for being so obstinate, but another part of her couldn't ignore the respect she had for him, even when he made her furious. The clock said 22, but the Stark Automotive building was far from silent. The lights on the 27th floor remained on, and the sound of tense voices filled the main meeting room. The launch of the company's newest car, a high-performance sports model, was in jeopardy. Test reports showed critical flaws in the steering system, and the time to fix the problem was practically non-existent. Dominic was at the head of the table, his posture rigid and his eyes fixed on a set of graphics projected on the wall. His impeccable suit contrasted with the chaotic atmosphere around him, but his expression carried something different, a tension he rarely let show. "I don't care how you do it, but this needs to be resolved before the investor presentation," he said, his voice cold but full of authority. The group of engineers exchanged nervous glances, unable to find an immediate solution. While the others discussed possible fixes, Dominic stood back, resting his hands on the table and looking down, as if trying to concentrate in the midst of the chaos. It was rare to see him waver, but here he was, faced with a crisis he couldn't control alone. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. And now he knew it was, in a way, the responsible for all this. I didn't know, he said, his voice failing. "Ava, I swear, I didn't know." She shook her head, her face flooded with pain and anger. And does that make any difference? You were still there. You still did that. Dominic stepped toward her, but she backed away, lifting a hand to stop him. Don't try to justify, she said. I spent years trying to understand how unjust could happen, and now you tell me it was you. The silence in the room was overwhelming. Dominic wanted to say something, anything, to try to fix what was broken between them. But he knew that some things could not be fixed with words. I never wanted to hurt anyone, he said finally, his voice full of weighing. Since that day, all I do is try to control every detail of my life, because I never want to make a mistake that costs so expensive. I know this doesn't erase what happened, but it's the truth. Ava stared at him for a few more seconds, his heart at war. Part of her wanted to scream, blame, hate him. But another part recognized the genuine pain in his eyes, the same pain she carried all these years. I don't know if I can forgive you, Dominic, she said, her voice faltering. I understand. He replied, without looking away. But no matter how much you hate me, I want you to know that I'm sorry. More than I can express. Without saying anything else, Ava left the room, leaving Dominic alone with his guilt and regret. Ava walked through the lighted streets of the city that night, trying to ignore the cold wind that shivered his skin. But inside it, the real cold came from another source, the confusion that dominated his mind since the truth was revealed. She stopped in front of a cafeteria, the reflection of the lights of the sign blurred by her teary eyes. Your sister, Emily. She could hear the girls' children's laugh, the sound of the car's engine that night, and then the overwhelming silence that followed the news of the tragedy. And now Dominic was at the center of all this. The image of his devastated face, his words of repentance, haunted Ava as an echo. He was the reason for his pain, but also the reason for many of his achievements. The irony of this torn it, she entered the small coffee, asking for a cappuccino, almost without realizing what she was doing. When he sat in an empty corner, he took his cell phone and saw work notifications, including project team messages. A message from Dominic was highlighted at the top. Ava, I know I can't change the past, but I want you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to regain your trust. You don't have to answer now, but whatever you need, I'm here. She hung up the phone, but couldn't ward off the words. Something inside her knew Dominic was being sincere, but forgiveness was something she didn't know yet could offer. The next day, Ava arrived at the technical laboratory earlier than usual. The project required its full attention, and, despite everything, she knew that the crisis in the company was greater than her personal conflicts. Dominic was there, already adjusting some pieces of the prototype. He looked at her as soon as he entered, but said nothing, just a brief nod, respecting the space she clearly still needed. The silence between them was dense but not hostile. It was a silence loaded with uni-dead words, repressed emotions. Ava put his things on the table and started working, ignoring the tension around him. For hours, they only exchanged technical phrases, maintaining their focus on work. But Dominic couldn't stop looking at her when she thought she wasn't being noticed. The determination in his gaze, the way his firm hands adjusted every detail of the engine. It was as if he was seeing Ava for the first time, not just like a brilliant engineer, but as a person he couldn't help but admire deeply. This is ready for the next test, said Ava, finally breaking the silence as he adjusted the last piece. Dominic nodded, approaching. I'm going to drive the car, he said. She looked at him for a moment, frowning. Are you sure? Isn't that something you usually leave for test pilots? I need that, he replied, his voice calm, but full of something deeper. I need to be in control, Ava. I need to see this working with my own eyes. Ava noticed the weight behind his words. Maybe it was your way of facing the ghosts of the past. She nodded slowly, giving him room. On the test track, the car engine route. Like an awakened beast. Dominic adjusted the helmet, his hands squeezing the steering wheel harder than necessary. When Ava approached to check the last details, he looked at her. If something goes wrong, you can fix it, right? He asked, a weak smile playing on his lips. Ava rolled his eyes, but a corner of his mouth bowed in a reluctant smile. It won't go wrong, Dominic nodded, connecting the engine and accelerating. When he fired on the track, Ava observed, feeling an anxiety that she didn't want to admit. While the car made fast and straight curves, she realized something. Dominic was not just a CEO, or someone trying to compensate for past mistakes. He was, in essence, someone who sought redemption. When he finally stopped the car at the end of the track, Ava ran to check the test data. The smile on her face was impossible to hide. The results are solid, she said, looking at him. That means we got it. Dominic took off his helmet and got out of the car, his smile was almost shy. We did it, he repeated, but his eyes were fixed on Ava. For a moment, they stood there, standing in front of each other, the engine noise dissipating in the cold air. Thank you for not giving up, Ava said, finally breaking the silence. Dominic stepped forward, the intensity in his almost unbearable gaze. It has never been an option to give up on you, Ava, he said, his voice low and firm. She felt an unexpected heat grow in her chest, but there was still a barrier inside her that prevented her from surrendering completely. "I need time," she said, her hesitant voice. "I give you all the time you need," Dominic answered. "But I don't go anywhere." The presentation of the new model was scheduled for that night. The main hall of the convention center shone with spotlight and flashes, while journalists, investors and auto enthusiasts occupied each seat. On stage, the car prototype covered by a black fabric looked like a promise waiting to be revealed. Behind the scenes, Ava adjusted the latest details of the interactive display system that would demonstrate the innovative engine technology. Despite being focused, she couldn't ignore the whirlwind of emotions that took over. It was the moment they had both worked tirelessly to reach, but also the moment that marked a turning point in their life and their relationship with Dominic. She felt her presence even before seeing him. Dominic entered the room, impeccably dressed in a black suit, but with an expression that was anything but cold. He looked less like a CEO and another vulnerable man, and at the same time determined. "Is it ready?" he asked, stopping a few steps away. Ava raised his eyes to him, realizing that for the first time there was something genuinely disarmed in his gaze. "Ready," she replied with a discreet smile. Dominic took a deep breath, as if he wanted to say something else, but hesitated. Finally, he reached out, a simple gesture, but meaningful. Ava looked at her hand for a moment before squeezing her. It was a brief touch, but it carried the strength of a silent promise. They would face it together. The event began with an introductory speech by Dominic. He was a natural speaker, confidence overflowing with each word. But for those who knew him well, and Ava was starting to know him better than he would like to admit, there was something different. He did not speak only as the leader of a company. He spoke as someone who finally understood the power of collaboration. "Today we present more than a car," he said, his eyes traveling the audience before they briefly landed in Ava, which was next to the stage. "We present a vision. An idea built with passion, innovation and, above all, teamwork." He gestured to Ava, inviting her to take the stage. Ava hesitated for a second, the weight of the almost overwhelming moment, but the determination won. She walked to him, the applause echoing around. When she stopped alongside Dominic, he turned to her, handing the microphone. It was more than a gesture, it was a public demonstration of trust, something he rarely granted to anyone. Ava took a deep breath, holding the microphone with his hands slightly trembling, but his voice came out firm. "What you are about to see is the result of a shared belief that we can challenge the limits of the possible. This car is not just a machine, it is proof that when we trust bold ideas and the people around us, we can create something truly extraordinary." She pushed a button on the console in front of her, and the black fabric was removed from the car, revealing the model in all her glory. The audience was silent for a moment, absorbing the elegant design and the technological innovations displayed in the panels around the stage. Then the hall exploded in applause and flashes of cameras. Ava looked at Dominic, who stared at her with a mix of pride and something deeper, something she couldn't completely define. Later, after the presentation, Ava and Dominic met on the building's terrace, away from the buzz of the event. The night air was fresh, and the city's lights spread like artificial stars on the horizon. "It was a success," said Ava, leaning against the grid and looking at the horizon. "It was," Dominic answered, stopping beside her. "Thanks to you." Ava shook his head, smiling slightly. "Thanks to us." He laughed, a low, genuine sound that she was not used to hearing. "You know, Ava, I used to believe that control was everything. That if I could control every detail, I would never make the mistakes of the past again." She turned to him, seeing the vulnerability on his face. "But working with you showed me that not everything can or should be controlled. Sometimes you have to trust in other people. And, in ourselves." Ava felt a knot form in his throat. It was rare for Dominic to be so open, so honest. "And you showed me that sometimes risk is worth it," she replied, her soft but firm voice. "I think trust works in both ways." Dominic. He stared at her, the air around them looking more dense. "I want you to know that I trust you, Ava. Not only at work, but in everything. And I want to try. No matter what that means." Ava felt her heart accelerate, but at the same time something inside her calmed down. She knew that those words were not just an empty gesture. They were a commitment. "I want to try too," she said, finally letting a wider smile escape. Dominic hesitated for a moment before taking a nearest step, his hand brushing hers. It was a subtle but meaningful touch. Ava did not go back. That moment, under the night sky and the city's lights, they both realized that they had overcome more technical or professional challenges. They had found something rare and precious. Each other. The morning was radiant, with the sun illuminating the impeccable asphalt of a running track surrounded by green hills. The engines snore in the background, a sound that carried promises of speed, challenge and freedom. Ava was standing next to a sports car recently out of the laboratory, the reflection of sunlight dancing in his metal painting. She wore a gray running jumpsuit with red details, the helmet resting on her arm. Dominic was a few feet from her, adjusting her gloves and watching the horizon. Dressed in his own black jumpsuit and silver details, he looked like the personification of control and confidence. But when he turned to look at Ava, his eyes showed something that only she knew, a trace of vulnerability he had learned to accept, along with the respect and admiration they now shared. "Are you ready for that?" he asked, walking to her with that slightly challenging smile that Ava now knew to be a mixture of provocation and affection. She lifted an eyebrow, smiling back. "The question is, are you?" Dominic laughed, a sound that she was beginning to realize to be rare and precious. "I just hope you are not very disappointed when I cross the finish line first." Ava rolled his eyes, but the smile remained. "Just enter the car, Dominic. Let's see if your skills are up to your arrogance." The two positioned themselves in their respective cars, and the surrounding environment seemed to silence for a moment, as if the world had paused to watch. Ava squeezed the steering wheel, feeling the leather under his fingers as his eyes focused on the track ahead. It was as if everything in her life had led to that moment, not by the race itself, but from what she meant. Beside her, Dominic adjusted the mirrors. But his thoughts were in Ava. He was not sure how he had arrived there, next to a woman who challenged all his convictions, but he knew it was exactly where he should be. The flag was erected, and in seconds they both fired. The sound of the engines roaring like thunder by the track, while the cars moved at high speed. Ava felt the adrenaline running in his veins. Every curve, every acceleration was a dance she knew well. But there was something else in that race. She was not just competing, he was sharing something he loved with someone who, in unexpected ways, had become essential to her. Dominic, in turn, was divided between the desire to win and the pure pleasure of seeing her lead. He never imagined that sharing his passion for races with someone else could be so liberating. Each movement she made on the track was a reflection of her determination, and he could not avoid a smile by thinking about how she had challenged and transformed her life. In the last curve, Ava was ahead, and Dominic knew he would need to risk it to exceed her. He accelerated, and the two crossed the finish line almost at the same time. When they got out of the cars, they were both laughing, panting and still feeling the adrenaline pulse. Ava took off her helmet, her misaligned hair falling into waves as she looked at Dominic with a glow of triumph in her eyes. "I won," she said, with a wide smile. "There is no way," Dominic replied, laughing as he took off his helmet. "It was a draw. "Nothing," Ava insisted, crossing his arms. "But okay, we can discuss this later." Dominic took a step closer, the proximity between them as natural as breathing. He lifted his hand and pushed a strand of hair from her face, the soft, intimate gesture. "I think I will never earn a discussion with you," he said, the low voice, but full of affection. "Probably not," Ava replied, smiling. Dominic tilted his head, his eyes fixed on hers. "All good. Because I already got what matters." Ava felt the heat rise to his chest, his words reaching something deep inside her. He didn't need to say anything else. She knew he was talking about her, about them, what they had built together, even in the adversity. Without thinking too much, Ava took a step ahead and pulled him to a kiss, his arms wrapping his neck. Dominic held her around the waist, pulling her closer, and for a moment all that existed was both of them. When they walked away, still smiling, Ava shook his head. "You're a walking cliché, you know, and you love it," Dominic answered, with that smug smile she hated admitting. It was irresistible. That same day, as the sun was beginning to put on, Ava and Dominic watched the team dismantle the cars and close the circuit. They were sitting on a low wall, side by side, their shoulders touching slightly. "So what is coming now?" Ava asked, looking at the horizon. Dominic looked at her, his face softening. "Whatever we want. Together." She turned to him, smiling, and at that moment I knew he was right. No matter what the future brought, they would face together. And as the sun disappeared on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and red, Ava felt a peace he had not experienced for years. It was not the end of something, but the beginning of everything. Our story for today comes to an end, friends, but before we say goodbye, I need your help to keep this rhythm of stories alive. If this story moved, inspired, or simply entertained you, don't hesitate to give this video a like. It's as simple as a click, but it means the world to us. Do you want more stories like this one? Then subscribe to Happiness of Love and don't forget to activate the notification bell so you never miss any of our new adventures. Remember, we have a new video every 2 days. Share this video with your friends and family. Who knows? You might inspire someone to make a positive change in the world. Leave us a comment letting us know which part of the story touched your heart the most. We love reading your thoughts and connecting with you. And if you're watching this on your phone, don't forget to hit the hype button to show your enthusiasm and help us reach even more people with these inspiring stories. Thank you for being part of the Happiness of Love community. Your support is like the heartbeat of this channel, vital and full of life. Oh, and before you go, Check out the video popping up on the screen right now, it's another amazing story you won't want to miss. See you in 2 days with another story that will take your breath away. Until then, keep the rhythm of love and inspiration alive, one beat at a time.